Okay, even though the story of Tel Sakki is mainly military, uh, and it's very hard not to deal with exactly what happened there. The, as part of the Livnot ideal, I'm not telling this story in order to tell a military story, but rather to try to figure out through the story what Jewish values we can learn from this story. That's the tradition of Livnot, and um, that's what we'll try to do here. And it's not the classic battle of let's shoot at them from here and go around the side and capture this hill and move on. It's a very strange story, or I would say, I think unique would be a better word. And there's so many things that happened here within less than 2 days that it's impossible to touch on everything. So many people were involved in what happened here. There's a lot of things that we still don't understand, even though this happened in 1973. And what's interesting is what has happened today to this very place. So we're talking about a hill in the Golan Heights called Tel Sakki. It has nothing to do with Japanese wine, I promise you. And it is here on our trusty CIA map, which we always use. And here are some of the places we've talked about beforehand. Gamla is in the central part of the southern Golan Heights. And we'll be talking today about El Al, not the airlines, but rather the army base that used to be a Syrian army base and was connected to Eli Cohen, which we talked about when we discussed the Eli Cohen trail, and then became as many IDF camps in the Golan Heights. When the IDF came in 1967, they simply took these Syrian army camps and made them into IDF camps. And still today, many of the places are former Syrian camps. So El Al is here on towards the southern part of this southern Golan Heights, and here, very close to the border, is a little hill called Tel Sakki. Apparently, the name comes from the Aramaic or perhaps the Arabic name for Hashkaya, which means irrigation, because there's a lot of irrigation canals in the area and a lot of springs, so that even in the summer, you'll see some green there. That's the theory. You don't know for sure how it got its name. And it's not a volcano in the explosive volcano kind of way, but rather it's a place that grew up high because of pressure from below, and the lava started flowing, kind of like the eruptions that you see in Hawaii, as opposed to, let's say, Mount St. Helens and other, Vesuvius and gigantic explosions. And therefore, there's a little hill there, and it's not that huge, but it kind of commands the area, and therefore it has strategic importance. You can also see the big red arrow on the right-hand side is the major thrust of the Syrian army in the south. They had another one in the north, and they had one in the south. In the north, they weren't able to break through. In the south, they were. And Tel Sakki was simply on the way, as the plan was that they were to break in, go on this road, go by Tel Sakki, and then continue down to the Kinneret, and then get to Nazareth, which would be, they thought, a friendly place, and then cut through to Netanya and split the country in two. And it's amazing to think how close they were to actually doing this. We're talking about, again, of course, Yom Kippur of 1973. This is the hill. It's not a good picture, but it doesn't matter. It's not a huge hill. It's really just a kind of a humble little volcano hill, but relative to its surroundings, it gives you a very good view of what happened. So let's start with the story. And if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to answer if people have questions. We're talking about Yom Kippur, which was Shabbat in 1973. The war started at a little before 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Shells, mortars, and bombs rained down into Israel from Syria. And of course, at the same time, there was an attack happening in the Sinai from the Egyptian army. Israel totally unprepared. They weren't humble enough to realize that perhaps they'd be surprised. They had been on high alert a few days beforehand. There were very few troops stationed on the Syrian border, but the ones who were there were very, very good. In order, for instance, to be in a tank unit and be on the front lines, you had to prove yourself. So there was an airborne unit in El Al, in the base in El Al, and Saturday morning before, like if the war broke out at 2 in the afternoon, in the morning at around 10, 11, they already realized that things were going to get bad. They thought it was going to be a battle day, and there had been many before that. This is one of the ways that Syria kind of put Israel to sleep, by having these battle days, which they always lost, and gave Israel the sense that, you know, there's no way that they're ever going to really be attacked in a serious war. So the army decided to send 5 soldiers and a driver under this man's command, whose name is Menachem, to Tel Sakki in order to be there and take some good binoculars and maps. And when the Syrians would fire into Israel, they would try to find in Syria where the firing was coming from and tell the army where it was from, and direct artillery fire back into Syria, because that's what they thought was going to be the day. So Menachem was a lieutenant in the 50th Battalion, and he took 4 other soldiers and a driver who was, they were all in the standing army. The driver was in the reserves. And they drove to Tel Sakki, which took them like about 10 minutes from the El Al base. And they went there, and they found that these are the people that actually went. Let's take a look at them. We're talking about 5 soldiers and a driver. So Menachem is the officer. His number 2 man is Shlomo. He is helping out. Lazy, which is Eliezer, but his nickname was Lazy, was also there. They had Shaya and Roni, who were with them, and the driver, Moshe. Not a good picture of him. That's the only one I could find. And here they're all dirty, and actually, this is Lazy as he got there. When the shelling started, they found refuge in this big cement block. And these were the people there, and their job was to simply be the eyes of the IDF and tell them what was going on, because the most important thing that the commanders need to know in the army is what is happening. And there's no way of really knowing. There were no satellites, there were no drones, and all we could do was rely on people, on people's reporting to know what was going on. And people who were fighting can't always focus on reporting. So these were, as it were, they were given, even though they were paratroopers, they were given a job of intelligence to simply look and watch and report back what they saw. This is a picture of the bunker, the only serious place up here on Tel Sakki. You can see it's a very small bunker. We're talking about a few meters, a few square meters. This is a picture taken later. It's not exactly the way it looked in 1973, but it's very, very close. It was kind of hidden on one side by some rocks. And you can see this place, you can kind of imagine, you know, millions of years before, or however long it was, you know, kind of like the magma coming up from the ground and pushing up, and then in the end, kind of flowing slowly and leaving these heavy boulders. So this is what they saw. And when when the bombing started, and we're talking about some of the most serious bombing ever, thousands and thousands of shells and bombs and planes coming in, and just on Tel Sakki and every other strategic place in the Golan. They took refuge here. And in another piece of cement that some of the other soldiers found on the side. This is the bunker. It's still there today. You can actually go in and see it. It's kind of a famous place today. And that's what it looks like today. They took out part of it, they moved it. And of course, after 1973, they built a whole nother story to the volcano because they understood of its importance. And so there's an underground emergency base here today that halavai, it would have existed in 1973. Some of you can kind of understand that Israel wasn't prepared because this is all that there was. And they should have, of course, it's all hindsight, taken every possible strategic point and fortified it. But because they were sure that nothing serious was going to happen, this is all there was. And inside, there were 2 bunk beds and room for just a few people, nothing big at all. So they're seeing this happen, and then the barrage stops, and the Syrian tanks start trying to break through. And in general, the Israeli soldiers in the tanks, as I said, they were very, very high quality. They were repelling the Syrian tanks, even though they were incredibly outnumbered. And everything was reported back by Menachem and the soldiers to El Al. Every plane that came from Israel to try to attack was shot down by the anti-aircraft missiles that Syria recently got from the Russians. They were some of the best in the world. And their tanks also were in excellent shape. They also had night sights, which the Israelis did not have. The Americans had that technology, but at the time, they didn't want to sell it to Israel for whatever reason. So night fell, and then things started getting bad because the Syrians had the advantage of numbers, they had the advantage of sights, and even though they were outnumbered sometimes 20 to 1, 30 to 1, and holding the line, they simply, slowly were able to break through. And a lot of the tanks, the Israeli tanks who were hit and taken out of action, some of the soldiers and some of the tanks that couldn't really function anymore came back to Tel Sakki because they knew there was a place there. And they got into this tiny bunker in order to get to safety and live to fight another day, as they say. One of the tanks in the area belonged to a unit led by a young, excellent officer named Yoav Yakir. This is Yoav. And he was very loved and respected by his men. And he was really holding the line with, and one of the best gunners on his team in his unit was Yitzchak Nagarka. This is him right before the Yom Kippur War. And you can see, if you can see from his darker complexion, he was born in India and was part of the many Jews who made Aliyah from India after the establishment of the State of Israel. And he was an excellent gunner. In other words, he's the one who puts the sight on the target and shoots. And he actually got a prize for hitting Syrian tanks on previous battle days, and he was awarded a special new tank soldier's uniform, which he wore very, very proudly, of course. During the fighting, unfortunately, Yoav's tank was hit by a shell from a Syrian tank, and Yoav was instantly killed. And Yitzchak went over. No one else wanted to do it. He loved him very, very much, and he went over to remove his officer's body. And as he brought him over to his tank, and they moved on to Tel Sakki, Yoav made a vow that if he was going to survive this war and marry his girlfriend Ilana, he would name his son when he would have a family in memory of his beloved commander, Yoav, and he did just that. So now we had not only 5 paratroopers and their driver on Tel Sakki, but we had another 33 tank soldiers, altogether some 39 people, and there were some dead soldiers with them too. And the tank soldiers were telling the others the stories, which were not good at all, and the morale on Tel Sakki was sinking quickly. So now it's early Sunday morning before dawn, and Menachem is talking with his battalion commander, whose name is Yoram. But Yoram is not considered a very cool name in Hebrew, for whatever reason. We won't go into it now. And so his nickname, until today, is Yaya. No one calls him, well, few people will dare to call him Yoram, but Yaya is the name that everyone used. He later went on to become a general, and did a lot of important work, writing also the ethical code of the IDF. And he already was a seasoned veteran in the paratroopers by then, and he was in charge of the 50th Battalion. And he was situated in El Al. He told Menachem that he should take all the functioning tanks and simply remove some of the soldiers from Tel Sakki and bring them back to El Al. And just before they were about to leave, it was still before dawn, Tel Sakki came under a very, very fierce, massive missile attack. And the soldiers who couldn't get back to the bunker found safety in the tanks. And when they went down the hill in the tanks, they saw that the Syrians were shooting at them. The tanks were all out of commission by this time, and there was no way for them to get back to El Al base. So they moved into the bunker. Now, when first light came out, now we're talking about Sunday morning, right? The war started on Shabbat, Yom Kippur, at 2 in the afternoon. During the day, the Israelis were able to hold back the Syrian onslaught. In the nighttime, they started breaking through. In the morning, at first light, the Menachem and the paratroopers on Tel Sakki looked down from the Tel, and they were stunned to see scores of armored Syrian cars, trucks, jeeps, full of soldiers, tanks driving by, all in all close to 1,000 soldiers, okay? And they were coming their way, and they had to go underneath Tel Sakki in order to continue. Now, one of the possibilities was for Menachem to simply say, look, let's just get into the bunker and not do anything. They don't care about us. We're not strategic importance here. Yeah, the hill's important, but like, they don't need to take us out in order to continue. So why should we even let them know that they're here? They're 1,000, we're 5, later they were more. Let's just let them go by. But to understand here, the wisdom of Menachem and the commanders is that the idea wasn't to win. It wasn't, we 5 will take out 1,000 troops. They knew that that wasn't going to happen, and they were probably going to end their life there. The idea was slow them down. It's not a zero-sum game, as it were. It's not a game at all. But it's not either we all win or we all lose. We need to slow them down, because every Israeli soldier in the standing army knows that the redemption will come when the reserves are called up and brought up to the Golan Heights, and with their numbers and with their experience, will start pushing the Syrians back. So it was not we're going to beat them, but rather we're going to stall them. And if we can stall them and prevent them from easily going down towards Tiberias, towards the rest of Israel, we've done our job. And they understood this, and understood that it would be a huge sacrifice, but that's what their job was. And this means that they had to have understanding of the big picture, the strategic picture, instead of just the tactical picture of what was going on their little hill. They understood this. Very similar, by the way, to the story of Gush Etzion in 1948, who realized that they were stopping the enemy from getting to Jerusalem, even though they knew that they weren't going to be able to totally stop them, or were just going to be able to slow them down. And what was very surprising was that we don't really have 100% all the answers to is the Syrians actually, as it were, fell into that trap. Instead of just forgetting and ignoring Tel Sakki and continuing down the road, they stopped. They just stopped everything and took all of this might and tried to conquer Tel Sakki. So the Menachem and the soldiers wanted to give the Syrians a feeling that there were a lot of people on the Tel, so they would shoot and then move to another place and shoot a little more, and this kept them back a while. But at some point, they saw the Syrian soldiers were grouping themselves. They put bayonets on their rifles. They still did that back in the 1970s, and they began climbing the hill. So they stopped their. They were able to stop the Syrian attack. The Syrians regrouped and reattacked, and the soldiers that were on the hill shooting down at the Syrians actually were able to prevent them. Now, not far from there, Menachem had a very good friend whose name was Benny. Here on the left, you can see Benny. He had blonde hair and curls and a mustache, and this is Menachem on the right. And here they're with another officer from their unit getting a prize for winning some competition. They were very, very good friends. And because Menachem had sent reports back to Yahya that there were tanks and half-tracks and armored cars moving towards El Al, Yahya sent Benny and afterwards another half-track to prevent these Syrian forces from coming towards El Al, and they were successfully able to actually stop one of the armored cars and destroy it. And then he heard on the radio what was going on with his friend Menachem. And no one told him, Benny, take all of your soldiers and go to Tel Sakki and help Menachem. But rather, he volunteered. He got on the radio and said, Yahya, using code, of course, I want to go and help my friend. He's going to be attacked by the Syrians. We have a force here. We're already here. We can go and help them. And Yahya kind of hemmed and hawed. He didn't really want to send him. He said, look, it's a suicide mission. Benny said, I need to go. I can't listen to this on the radio. I've got to go and help my friend. And Yahya reluctantly said, okay, you have the okay to do that. Afterwards, he second-guessed himself for a while. And as they're getting ready to go, there's morning fog, and a tank comes storming through the fog, and they think that it's a Syrian tank. They're about to shoot, but then they realize it's an Israeli tank that had wounded and was not functioning. And they came by, and the commander of the tank said, don't go even close to Tel Sakki. You're going to get, there's too many Syrians there. You've got to turn back. But Benny had already made up his mind. He's going to help his friend. And they drove the two cars towards Tel Sakki, and as they were taking a right-hand turn to go up to the Tel, the Syrians simply destroyed all of them. And everyone was killed except for two soldiers who crawled out and faked their death because the Syrians came and destroyed all the soldiers there. They had crawled over to the side, and they actually were able to survive, even though they were seriously wounded. And what was even worse was that Menachem, who knew that his friends were coming to save him, and they shot at the Syrians to distract them, he realized that his friends were killed, and that they were killed trying to help them. It was, of course, a terrible, terrible feeling. At the same time, Yahya actually sent another car to go and help when he heard that they were being attacked. But again, he couldn't really order people to go because it sounded very much like a suicide mission. So he went to the bunker where the rest of the soldiers were in El Al, and he said, I'd like for another armored car to go and rescue the rescue mission. They didn't know exactly what had happened. They didn't understand that almost everybody was killed. And what's interesting, instead of the soldiers trying to say, well, I don't really think it's a good idea, I don't really want to go, they fought each other to see who would go in the car. Because again, these people had been together, there was camaraderie, they were friends, and they wanted to help. And so a third car went. This time they tried to take a different route up the hill. The car got stuck. The Syrian tanks saw them. They hit them. Many were killed. There were 4 soldiers who escaped and actually got back to Israeli lines. But then they realized that no one's going to come and save them. And Menachem decided, along with, he told Yahya that he was going to take the people who were wounded, including the dead soldiers, and they were going to carry them on stretchers and bring them back to safety. And they actually started they're rescuing themselves, and they got about 80 meters, and then they realized that there's actually no way that they can get out. They're totally surrounded on the entire Tel by Syrians. They had been shooting down at the Syrians beforehand from their car. There was a heavy machine gun in the car. This is Benny, the last picture taken as he's driving to save his friends. Tel Sakki is here on the right in this area. And this is like an action photo, as it were, the last picture that we have of Benny, who was given the Medal of Honor. This is Shaya, one of the 5 paratroopers, who's on the half track. And you can see he's got a shooting from a very, very heavy machine gun, because his Uzi, which is in the foreground, is not going to help. And Menachem is shooting, and Roni, one of the other soldiers, is shooting at the Syrians, and Roni gets hit in the forehead and the chest, falls to the ground, and is taken away, and is lost consciousness and is very close to death. And Menachem, he knows this is what they have. They've got to shoot for this thing to prevent the Syrians from coming up. And Menachem, knowing that there's a good chance he's going to get hit, takes the heavy machine gun and starts shooting. He gets hit in the knee and is taken away. And then Shlomo, the third man, who realizes that his fate might not be any different, writes afterwards that he had to drag himself onto the chair and start shooting. But at some point, he simply ran out of ammunition. So all the people, 30-some people, were now in the bunker. And after they ran out of ammunition, and they were lying in the bunker, and Menachem was already hurt, he asked one of the tank soldiers, whose name was Moti, to go down and to one of the tanks and bring some more ammunition. Here again, you can see where the bunker was, and below them is where the tanks were, and that's Moti. He agreed. He went down with 2 other soldiers and brought some ammunition back. And as he's coming back, one of the paratroopers, who thinks that he's a Syrian, shoots him in 3 places. Okay, friendly fire, thinking he was a Syrian, and hits him in the knee, and in the arm, and in the forehead. Okay, and Moti makes it back somehow to the bunker, screams at the guy who hit him, and then who then, of course, was crying and apologizing as much as he could. Of course, he felt terrible, and they brought him into the bunker and laid him down and tried to bandage his wounds. Now, Moti, this man, feels that there's blood on his face that's dripping down from his head, and slowly, as he's lying down, and his helmet has not yet been taken off, he puts his hand up to his helmet, and he feels a hole in his helmet right where his forehead is. And he realizes he's already dead. He writes about this afterwards. I'm dead, and I'm having an out-of-body experience. I mean, it would be funny, except it's not. I mean, maybe in hindsight. What happened was, when the medic, when the people taking care of him took off his helmet, the bullet actually fell out. It was lodged in between the helmet and his forehead, and had pushed a little piece of rubber, very, very tough rubber, and had actually made a very, very shallow surface wound on his forehead, and that was the blood that was flowing down. He realized that he was still alive and that he wasn't dead, but he was going in and out of consciousness, fainting, coming back. And that's Moti afterwards, of course, was seriously, very seriously wounded until the very end of the story. The Syrians were still now coming up the hill. There was no ammunition. The Israelis were not shooting down at them. And Menachem realizes at the end of court that the end is close. He tells everybody to take out their maps, any secret information that they have, classified information, tear it up. He goes over to the big machine gun, takes out a piece so it won't be able to be used by the Syrians. It's a very powerful weapon. And nobody thought, of course, of surrendering to the Syrians because they knew what would that would probably mean death and maybe even worse, the torture. And back at El Al, all the soldiers had been evacuated, and only Yahya was there with a handful of others. The only way that he only had a very small radio there, and Menachem couldn't speak to Yahya directly. He had to go through another base in northern Israel and talk to, there was a woman soldier there who was relaying the messages back and forth, being like a third party in between. And so he says, Yahya's code name was Calcium Commander. He says, Calcium Commander, this is 616 Bet. This is the end. Please give our warmest regards to all the gang. We won't be seeing each other again. Over and out. And as the woman in the radio is relaying this to Yahya, she broke out in tears. And many of the people who were listening also were breaking out in tears. She was not alone. And some of the soldiers, even today, there are people who deal with these life and death situations with morbid humor. And in the bunker, hearing the Syrian tanks coming, some of the soldiers dealt with it by joking around and saying things like, we'll meet on the bulletin board, or I know this sounds terrible, but these are the things that were said. See you all in Har Herzl. You know, how could you even say such a thing? But this is a way psychologically for people to deal with what's going to happen. They realized they were most likely going to be killed. Menachem was very upset at this, and he had very harsh words. He says, the next person who even peeps will be personally shot by me. And of course, he didn't mean that, but everybody was very, very quiet. And he added then in a whisper, because he didn't want to, he understood that morale is very important here. He said, when this is all over and we win this war, we will have such a great feast in Jerusalem that they'll be talking about it for generations. Also a very strange thing to say. He took a prayer book out of his pocket and he slowly read Psalm 130, a very, very powerful psalm. From out of the depths I call to you, Hashem. God, hear my voice. May your ears be listening to the voice of my begging. Soon, everyone in the bunker could hear the voices of the Syrian soldiers approaching the southern entrance to the bunker. There were two entrances. Suddenly, someone shot bullets into the southern entrance. A number of soldiers were hit by the ricochets. And since the end was already near, Menachem made an on-the-spot decision to get up, storm through the northern entrance with some soldiers, go around the back and attack the Syrians who were shooting at them from the southern entrance, instead of just sitting there and being shot at. Remember, he was wounded, and many of the others were wounded too. So he got up, and some others, including Shalom, one of the tank soldiers, got up with him, and they started to leave the bunker. And as they're leaving, Menachem sees the hand of a Syrian soldier toss a grenade into the bunker, and it hits Menachem in the chest and falls to the floor, if you can imagine that. So Menachem instinctively turns around and yells, grenade, and everybody tries to hit the floor. And after 4 seconds, it exploded at the entrance to the bunker. Menachem was thrown hard against the wall from the blast and fell on Roni, who was already almost dead himself. Shalom was hit by shrapnel in his head and died immediately. Smoke and dust filled the small bunker. People were groaning, calling for their mothers, Ima. Some soldiers thought they were already dead, but weren't. Menachem felt as he was just about to faint. After a few minutes, the Syrians shot a rocket-propelled grenade towards the roof of the bunker. Soldiers again were tossed in the air. Shrapnel wounded others. Lazy, he was not a lazy man. It was his nickname for Eliezer. He was hit with tremendous force in the face and the chest, and he touched his face slowly to see if he was still around. He felt 2 ears, 2 eyes. On his tongue, he found a piece of shrapnel and a tooth that had stopped it, but he was still alive. A second grenade was tossed in, and Lazy and the others again were hit by shrapnel. Menachem was already about to faint, and the last thing that he could say was, if anyone is still alive in here, please go out and surrender and tell the Syrians that everyone inside is dead. And the one man who was standing was Yitzchak Nagarka, the soldier who had pulled his beloved officer off of the tank and brought him with him up to the Tel. He had been hit with shrapnel, and his ankle was hit by a bullet, but he still volunteered to go out and save the others. He later wrote, "I was the only one standing. There was no one but me who could actually leave the bunker. Maybe I stood a chance. I knew that the grenades were killing everybody, and that if the Syrians continued, there was no hope that anyone would survive. So I went out and I said, everybody's dead. I'm the only survivor." But he couldn't find the Syrians. They couldn't hear him. There were tanks there. There was a lot of noise. And finally, he was spotted by one of the Syrians, who with one hand motioned for Yitzchak to come towards him. But Yitzchak could see that his other hand was about to pull the trigger on his rifle. So he dodged, and he was shot at. Even though he surrendered, he was shot at by the Syrian. The bullets whizzed by his body, and he saw the second soldier who had seen him started shooting at him too. He dodged again, and the bullets whizzed past his face. And then finally, the soldier asked in sign language what was happening inside the bunker. And Yitzchak also used his hands to explain there were 4 soldiers, which for him was logical because that was the number of people in a tank, and they're all dead except for me. And the miracle here is that they believed him. And perhaps they wanted to believe him because none of the soldiers ever, from the beginning to the end, actually went into the bunker to see what was going on. They were too afraid. We have to remember that in 1973, a tank soldier only did tanks. They didn't know how to storm a place like this. They didn't know what was going on inside. They were scared. They were used to being in their tanks. So nobody really actually went in. Even the infantry soldiers who were there, nobody really went in. They shot in, they threw in grenades, and actually this actually saved their lives. They took Yitzchak and threw him on the ground and started smashing his head with a rifle butt. But he had on that special uniform, and the Syrian officer, thought that he was a pilot. And he said, "Quit hitting him. I'm going to bring him back to Damascus." And they took him to Damascus. Because he had that special uniform, his life was saved. The last few kilometers, by the way, before Damascus, he was dragged on the ground and nearly beaten to death by a Syrian mob when they learned that he was an Israeli. The soldiers who were inside were sure that he died, right? They heard him going out and yelling, "I'm surrendering," and they just heard shooting. They didn't hear Yitzchak anymore, and they were sure that he died. And so now there's really no reason to surrender. The Syrians didn't enter the bunker, not knowing there were still 23 soldiers alive there. And Shlomo, because Menachem was really in bad shape, he went around to all the wounded, trying to ease their pain. He gave tiny sips of water to people and encouraged them. Menachem asked Shlomo to put a grenade in his hand in case the Syrians were to enter the bunker. And at this point, the IDF reserves were already ascending the Golan with their tanks to stop the Syrian onslaught. When they arrived at El Al, and Yahya, of course, frantically tried to get them to go on a rescue mission to Syria, to Tel Sakki, but he was unsuccessful because they had a different agenda. They felt the entire state of Israel was in danger and not just a few dozen soldiers trapped on a hill. So it was a matter of priorities. And Yahya, of course, was very upset, but he did all he could to try to get a rescue mission going. In the end, the tanks, of course, did help and saved them. Meanwhile, on the hill, it was 7 p.m. And one of the tank soldiers begged for water. They had none left. Menachem asked for a volunteer to leave the bunker. And 6 soldiers actually crept right around the Syrians who were sleeping and brought water out. When they got to the tank to get the water, they actually got on the radio and talked to Yahya and told them what the situation was. He told them, the situation is deteriorating, you've got to help us. And Yahya said, just hang on, the whole IDF will be there soon and rescue them, which was an outright lie. But they were encouraged by the good news. They found some water, just a little, they brought it back. Then 2 other soldiers went to another tank, also stepping around sleeping Syrians. They also told Yahya about the situation and asked when they'd be rescued. And Yahya said, very, very soon. They're on their way, they're getting organized, and in the morning, the rescue mission would begin. He just made that up. And so they brought back some battle rations, old crackers, some water, and the soldiers wolfed it down. And then Shlomo was able to actually get to Yahya from the bunker. And he says, Calcium Commander, this is a soldier from 616 Bet. I'm all alone here with the wounded and the dying soldiers. If you don't come soon, all will be lost. And Yahya tells him, just hang on. I'm getting reinforcements. We'll arrive soon. And then Menachem gets out of his faint situation, gets on the radio himself and talks to Yahya. And they're able to speak directly. And he says to Menachem, just stay alive for only 20 more minutes. Please, I'm with you. I'm coming with the entire IDF. Do not give up now. And this encouraged everyone in the bunker. But it wasn't true. And this is a very fascinating subject. Menachem later said, little did I know that when Yahya told us he's on his way with the entire IDF, the big, huge IDF, he was actually completely alone in a dark field. He simply didn't want us to feel abandoned. We desperately needed hope, and he gave it to us. It was like a lifeline being thrown into a deep, dark well. He said, Menachem, the men are changing their tires, and we're on their way. Can't you hear them changing their tires? And then he made noises in the field as if people were changing tires. And he just made it all up, even though he moved around some shrubs and some rocks. And Menachem said later, if Yahya had told us the truth, that we're completely isolated in the Golan and totally surrounded by the Syrians, and there's no one to help us maybe for the next 24 hours, we would have died. He says they would have died. He gave us this incredible power and strength to stay alive. This is a fascinating subject, the whole idea of the psychology and the importance and the ethics. Can you lie? Are you allowed to? Is that okay? But Menachem actually feels it is something that actually saved him. So now we're talking, it's 8:30 in the morning, Monday morning, right? This all started on Shabbat in the afternoon, and the IDF had begun its pushback of the Syrians towards Syria, and they were succeeding. The people in the bunker could hear that there were tanks going north. They didn't know if they were Israeli tanks going north or Syrian tanks retreating north. It was actually both. And they were very, very happy. But there were still Syrians on the Tel right around them, and they had to keep their silence. So Yahya kept telling them that in 20 minutes, the IDF would reach them. And then just another 20 minutes, and he kept on saying, the armored cars are already on their way. You know, they'll soon be there to rescue them. And at 10 a.m., finally, a very big IDF artillery barrage hit Tel Sakki. But what happened was some of the Syrian soldiers who didn't want to get hit by the Israeli artillery looked for a place to hide. And where are they going to go? Into the bunker. So they came to the southern entrance of the bunker. They still didn't go in because there might be still soldiers there that might kill them, but they were there. They saw Ronnie's body. At this point, he was already dead, unfortunately. And they begin to wonder if maybe there are soldiers inside. And just in case they shot bullets into the bunker, and the trapped Israelis who were inside heard them argue between themselves in Arabic if the Israelis were dead or alive. Nobody made a sound. A number of soldiers, including Menachem and Shlomo, readied their guns to shoot just in case. They had their grenades in their hands. They took out the pins. They were sure that Syrians didn't take prisoners, and they knew what had happened. They thought they knew what had happened to Yitzhak, and so they were going to go down fighting. The Syrians decided to toss in yet another grenade, a huge explosion. Everybody's hit with shrapnel, and then one of the Syrians says in Arabic, "That's it, they're dead," and they left. And they thought that was it, but 15 minutes later, they heard Arabic again. At the bunker entrance, different soldiers came, and they threw in another grenade. And the soldiers said afterwards, "We were already apathetic about the huge explosions and the hot shrapnel flying all over. You can actually get used to that too." And Menachem says that he felt like, okay, just take the bunker, you deserve it. Just take it, just get this over with. People fainted, people came back from fainted. And at 10:45, Shaya woke up from his unconscious state and started yelling, "Mayim, mayim, water, water." This is a famous story that's told by many people who visit the Tel. His friends tried to get him to shut up, but and tell him that there was no water and there were Syrians outside, but he was lying underneath one of the beds. He didn't seem to understand what was going on, and he didn't stop yelling. And Menachem later remembered and said the following: "I had no alternative. I can't allow these cries to kill the rest of us." And then he writes something very, very powerful. "My mother, the only member of her family to survive the Holocaust, suddenly appears in front of me. I remember a story she shared from long ago. Germans were searching a home where Jews were hiding under the floor. A baby began to cry, and the mother was forced to smother it. My mother's presence reminds me of this story, and I realize I have no other choice but to order this tough decision. I gave the order to Lazy to strangle Shaya." Lazy, who was seriously wounded and could barely move, somehow scooched himself over to Shaya and put the fingers of his broken hand over Shaya's mouth. But Shaya took his hand and started twisting it, causing even more immense pain to Lazy. And then Shlomo, who was nearby, in his wisdom and his cool, came up with an alternative. He took apart one of the cigarettes that he had, and he wrote on it with a pen, "Shut up, be quiet. There are Syrians outside, and your yelling will get us all killed if you are not quiet." And then he put it in front of Shaya's face, lit his lighter just for a few seconds so Shaya could see it. And Shaya read the words and became quiet and calmed down. The grenades had shattered his eardrums. And like many of the others, he had already kind of lost it. Shlomo said afterwards, "Shaya is fortunate that I smoked in those days, because had I not, I would have strangled him. I'm not quite sure if I would have been able to live with myself today, but I would have done it. And I believe that in reverse, he would have strangled me as well. It was not just my life there, but there were other soldiers too." Shaya later said, "After the war, I heard all this talk of them trying to strangle me. I don't remember any of it. I do remember me screaming and feeling like I'm dying, and I know that Shlomo saved my life." Everybody remembers sometimes the same thing in very different ways. It was 11 o'clock, and Yahya finally came with a team of 5 armored cars, 2 ambulances, and was driving right behind the IDF reserve tanks who were pushing the Syrians back. At 1 p.m., they reached Tel Sakki. Their job was to rescue the soldiers in the bunker, but also to collect the bodies of the fallen, which was a terrible, terrible thing because they knew them personally. Inside the bunker, the soldiers were hoping that they heard Israeli soldiers, but they weren't sure. And then they heard someone yell towards the bunker, "Hey, are there any tank soldiers here?" And Moti, who was seriously wounded, jumped off of the bed where he was lying and ran outside. And he was blinded by the light and couldn't see anything. And finally, when he opened his eyes, he saw soldiers the age of his parents, because they were reserve soldiers. They were reserve tank soldiers. And they were in shock, because then they saw one by one all these young soldiers who were the ages of their kids come out of the bunker one by one, wounded, bleeding, with torn clothes, black all over, and looking totally dazed. The reserve soldiers started to cry from emotion, and it looked as their kids, as it were coming out of hell. Many still had held live grenades in their hands and couldn't even open their fingers after grasping the grenades for hours. Many cried themselves as they emerged. It was a very emotional moment. Those who were the most seriously wounded were evacuated to the hospital by helicopter, and these included Menachem, Lazy, Shaya, and Moti. There wasn't room for Moti, so they had to remove the heavy machine gun from the helicopter, and they had to have Moti sitting up so he wouldn't choke from, he was in bad condition, and they had to tie him to part of the helicopter. The rest of the people were wounded. They were all wounded. Were taken by ambulance to the hospital. And Shlomo said later, as I left the bunker, I discovered my legs had been hit by a grenade and that one of my legs is totally broken. But the entire time I was in the bunker, I felt nothing at all. Only later did I discover that I have permanent hearing damage. But of course, the main wounds were in their souls. And that doesn't get helped by an operation in the hospital. Let's go back to Yitzchak Nagarkar. This is Shalom Fahima, who was hit by shrapnel in the head. The bunker as we know it today, we'll get to this in a moment. Yitzchak Nagarkar was 8 months in with the other POWs, tortured, beaten, abused, humiliated in Syrian prisons. Now he was sure that all the people in the bunker were dead, and he felt that he was responsible because he left instead of staying with them. And now going back, he would of course be reunited with his father. His mother had already passed away, and his girlfriend Ilana, but he'd have to face their families of all the people in the bunkers who were going to want to know what happened. And he would be blamed for leaving them and abandoning them. And he didn't want to do this. When the POW exchange finally happened, they were flown back to Israel. And as he stepped off the plane, he embraced his father and his girlfriend and walked to the cab that would take them back home. And on the way back, a man stopped him and said, "Itzik, do you remember me?" He had no idea who he was. "Don't you remember Tel Sakki and all the soldiers in the bunker?" And Itzik says, "Of course I remember them," and with a very sunken face. "They're all dead." And the man says, "Dead? No, they're all alive, and it's thanks to you. You saved them all. You convinced the Syrians that we were all dead." And he says, "You were in the bunker too?" He says, "Yes, I'm Lazy from the paratroopers." "Oh, now I remember you. Are you sure they're really alive?" He says, "Except for Shalom, who was killed by the grenade the Syrians tossed in, we're all alive. We waited for you so we could have the feast in Jerusalem that Menachem promised." Just to take a look at some of the pictures here. This is Yitzchak Nagarkar coming back to the Tel to explain to soldiers and civilians what happened there. He calls it part of his therapy. And this, they actually, in order to find all the soldiers who were in Tel Sakki, they put an ad in the newspaper saying, "With the return of Yitzchak Nagarkar from Syrian POW camp, our friend is returned. We are asking all the people who were wounded, who were together, stuck and trapped in Tel Sakki from the 6th to the 8th of October, and everybody who helped save them, to please call Menachem Ansbacher at this number in Jerusalem, or Moti in Ramat Gan at this number, in order to prepare the great feast." Indeed, Yitzchak married Ilana, and later they actually moved to the Golan Heights. Of course, Ilana knew what she was getting into. Everybody who was in that bunker was seriously wounded in their soul. They had very, very strong, incredible strength to last, but once they lasted and the rescue mission was over, they had to deal with reality, and reality did not smile at them. Moti, this is Moti. He became a very famous archaeologist, Moti Aviam, and he became the chief excavator of Yodfat. What's amazing about Yodfat is that, according to Josephus, a very similar story happened in Yodfat that happened to Moti in the bunker. Here you can see he came back and told his story. He wrote. Everybody afterwards started writing years later, some of them 25 years after the battle started writing. And here he is in the bunker again. And what's fascinating is when he dug Yodfat, he knew that Josephus writes that Josephus and 40 other people from Yodfat hid in a cistern so that the Romans wouldn't find them. But in the end, they did find them, and that Josephus had suggested committing suicide. And in the end, Josephus and one other person actually survived the suicide. Now, imagine what's going on in this man's mind, how strong one has to be in order, first of all, to survive and be normal and go on and have a career as one of the major archaeologists in Israel, teaching in Israel and outside of Israel, and continuing to dig this day. And here he's going to Yodfat and digging in a place that has a story so similar to his own. And wow, that's a very, very powerful story in itself. And this is Lazy, many years later, about 25 years later. Lazy was taken to the hospital, and he later said the following: "The doctor threw my clothing to the side so he can immediately cut and remove the bullet and the shrapnel from my chest. When he removed the bullet, he became suspicious about how I could have survived such a direct wound to the heart. He suspected something must have slowed the impact from this particular kind of bullet. He went exploring to find the answer for himself and began searching through my bloody clothes. I woke up from the operation, and the doctor brings me a prayer book." Here he is holding it in his left hand. "My pocket-sized high holiday machzor was with me in my breast pocket. The bullet had permeated the book, fanned out, and stopped 1 millimeter from my heart. If I had used my daily regular prayer book, I would have died because it is much thinner." These are just a few of the incredible stories that have to do with Tel Sakki. And today, Tel Sakki is a monument for those who fought here, both those who died and those who survived. And it's a kind of a school that can teach lessons to everyone, whether you be a soldier or a civilian. And I want to talk about one project. This is Menachem years later. And I want to talk about Yakov Sullivan, who, by the way, for all you Lifnot folks, he happens to be a relative of Aaron Butzer. And he is kind of like adopted Tel Sakki as his own. He lives here in the Golan, a neighbor of mine. And he takes groups to Tel Sakki, tells them the story of what has happened, but then has a challenge. And he tries to teach some of the lessons of Tel Sakki in a very, very fascinating experiential way, and not just a lecture, taking people underground into the bunker, the new bunker that you can see pictured here, and the old bunker that is made out of cement. And I highly recommend any of you coming back to Israel to contact this man, Yaakov Sullivan. He has a company called Slingshot, and use his services when you're here in Israel to have a special experience that will also teach Jewish values. So even though he's related to Aaron, or maybe because, he also is using Tel Sakki to teach values, Jewish values, values that are used still today in the IDF. And you simply remember the name Slingshot, and you'll be able to contact him. I'd like to finish with, to sum it all up, and what are really the Jewish values that we can learn from Tel Sakki? We'll finish with the picture of Menachem here, who really was 20 years old, and was in command of everybody in that bunker. Most of us, when we were 20, we weren't doing serious things. We weren't saving people's lives. This man was an officer already at 20, and he had to make decisions that most people who live a full life of 120 years don't have to make. Incredible amount of pressure. After many, many years, he actually agreed to go and get help. He wrote a book recently, fascinating book years ago, about how he was able to kind of go through a series of meetings with psychologists and working on himself and writing in order to kind of cure himself from the pain and the dysfunctionality that people, all the people who were in this bunker situation were facing. Some of them had trouble keeping jobs. Some of them had trouble keeping their marriages going and their families' marriages. They'd not be able to sleep at night. They'd have nightmares. The classic PTSD things that Israel didn't really know about and didn't take care of back in 1973, 1974. So I want to mention just a few Jewish values, and there are many, many more, like the idea of courage and, you know, and faith, etc. But here are just a few that we'll just mention quickly and finish with that. Miracles and the gratitude for them. There were people who have said in the past that here in Israel, miracles are just a normal way of life. We have to remember that in the beginning, there were 5 soldiers on the hill and a driver, and there was an army of thousands that had to pass by them as they marched towards Israel, and a few delayed the many and prevented them really from penetrating into Israel, and this was a miracle. And therefore, the Jewish value of gratitude would have us all be thankful for such a miracle. And thank, this depends, of course, on your belief system, thank Hashem, thank the soldiers, thank the world for allowing this miracle to happen. Another value that we know that has been with us since the beginning of the Jewish people is that numbers are not the most important thing. They can help at times, but they're usually not the things that make or break the battle. The strength is sometimes in our spirit, in our soul, in our willpower. As Shlomo said after the war, numbers are not always tantamount when trying to save lives. More soldiers were killed in the rescue missions than were lost at Tel Sakki in the bunker. The IDF does not make a numerical calculation before saving lives. If it did, the army would not be what it is today. But every Israeli knows that in each situation, the army will do whatever is necessary to rescue them. And this knowledge is what helps keep morale. The sanctity of human life. Okay, Shlomo said after the war, before the war, I was indifferent to life. If I died, so what? After the war, I saw life through a different lens and realized how fragile I am. Now, when I'm in the car and I see a young boy drive recklessly, I want to scream at him. Are you crazy? Do you think your car's going to protect you? You can die in a second. Doesn't a kiss or love mean anything to you at all? That's a very powerful message that he took away from his experience in Tel Sakki. Humility, which we talked about last week. Many people, from civilians to security experts to military leaders to psychologists, believe that the main lesson of the Yom Kippur War of 1973 is humility. After the famous and quick 6-day war in 1967, Israelis became oversure of themselves. They felt invincible. The IDF never practiced how to retreat or what happens when you're losing or how to cope with defeat. This attitude also lulled most of the intelligence community into believing that Israel would simply never be attacked, despite all the signs to the contrary. Giving people the benefit of the doubt and trying to understand difficult people. In Ethics of the Fathers in Pirkei Avot, we talk about judging people favorably. It's also a verse in Leviticus. And I think the story of Shaya, when he's crying out for water, very, very famous story, teaches us that we need to learn how to deal with difficult people. I'm not calling Shaya a difficult person. I don't know how any of us would have even survived until then and kept our sanity. But it took a person with the wisdom and the cool of Shlomo to be able to understand that it's not exactly what it seems like, and that we sometimes need to put ourselves in the place of the difficult people to understand where they're coming from. And this story of how to deal with your comrades and how to work with them instead of against them is a very, very powerful lesson from the story of Tel Sakki. Morale in extenuating circumstances that deal with life and death. Sometimes you need to joke, sometimes you have to lie, like Yahya did. And interestingly enough, Menachem actually justifies totally and is thankful that Yahya lied to them. He doesn't believe they would have survived if they really knew what was going on. I know that brings up a lot of questions, including ethical questions, not only psychological questions. But for instance, Rabbi Nachum of Breslov teaches taught that fighting depression is very important. And sometimes you even have to fake it and pretend that you're happy in order to beat depression. And morale and the state of your soul is sometimes more important than the power of your gun. And lastly, brother keeping. One of the huge lessons from the Cain and Abel story is that we are supposed to be our brother's keepers, brothers and sisters, as the song goes. More than anything else, there was brotherhood here, camaraderie. People took responsibility for others. It was if here on Tel Sakki, the Israeli soldiers made a tikkun for what Cain did to Abel. Before we finish, I'd like to just show two books that can be used to understand more the Tel Sakki. This is a fascinating book recently put out by Yitzchak Nagarker, who tells his story of the battle and being in the bunker and his 8 months of being in prison, but not in a regular book form. It's in comic form with the help of his son and an artist. For those of you who've read about the Shoah with Maus, M-A-U-S, this book is very, very powerful. It is in Hebrew, but there are not a lot of, it's less about the words, the pictures and the words together tell his story. Very, very powerful. The only book in English that there is on the subject is called Crying for Ima. And this is a book that was printed in the United States, and you can get it on Amazon. And it's by a woman named Hallie Lerman, who is a relative of one of the people who fell at Tel Sakki in the rescue mission. His name was Jacob Ramon. Raymond was his previous name. He's from Seattle. He made Aliyah with his family and was a very beloved medic in the unit and was killed as in the rescue mission with Benny to save the people of Tel Sakki. And she, as his aunt, came back to Israel years later and did a photo essay, talked to almost all the people that she could get to, from Yahya down to the people who were with him in the bunker, and wrote a very, very powerful story about Jacob in particular and the situation during the Yom Kippur War in general. And today at the site, there is one of the soldiers who afterwards moved to the United States and made a lot of money, was able to come back and start with the other soldiers an NGO that's taking care of Tel Sakki. There's meetings there, there's ceremonies there every year, and there's a beautiful monument there today with pictures and the names of the people who fell. And again, they're trying to use Tel Sakki not just a place to tell the story, but also to teach values. And that's what we're all about. Thank you very much for your ears.